Folks, what a sight seeing Jason Van Dyke, the Chicago cop, led away in handcuffs after a jury gave their verdict guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Laquan McDonald. Van Dyke is the first Chicago police officer in half a century to be found guilty of murder for an on-duty shooting. He'll face a minimum of 6 years in prison when he is sentenced by the judge. Folks, here's the verdict as it was read in the courtroom this afternoon in Chicago.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of second-degree murder. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, first shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, second shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, third shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, fourth shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, fifth shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, sixth shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, seventh shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, eighth shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, ninth shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, 10th shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, 11th shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, 12th shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, 13th shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, 14th shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, 15th shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of aggravated battery with a firearm, 16th shot. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, not guilty of official.
Well, he got one good piece of good news right there, not guilty when it came to official misconduct. I wanted you to see or listen to the jury giving all of those guilty verdicts because it is very rare to see a police officer who is convicted of killing somebody on the line of duty, especially someone who is African American. Again, he can serve a minimum of 6 years. He must serve 85% of that term, the judge, but it could go up to 20 years. Now, the other issue, though, is that the jury could have found him guilty of first-degree murder, which could carry a life sentence. They chose, though, to actually downgrade it to second-degree murder. Let's go to reporter Domati Pongo, who, of course, has been covering this whole trial for us. Domati, this has been very interesting when you look at this decision. And even though there are people who are very, I won't say excited, but pleased that he was found guilty, it still, though, speaks to the fundamental issue of juries unwilling to find officers guilty of first-degree murder.
Yeah, absolutely. And so people are kind of wrestling with that. Folks are calling it bittersweet. Now, the second-degree murder charge, people were, we talked about this, worried that carries a far lesser sentence. It could carry only probation, but those aggravated battery charges have a range of 6 to up to 30 years. And so that is giving people, we've got protests already happening right now in the streets, which is a mix of celebrating and a mix of saying that sentencing needs to reflect what it is that Jason Van Dyke did.
And Domati, again, on that issue, when you look at when the judge gave his instructions, he did tell them that they did not have to find him guilty of first-degree murder. He gave them that option. Now, one of the things that jumps out, he was indicted by the grand jury on first-degree murder.
Yeah, and we, really interesting here at WGN Radio, we just got done speaking with State's Attorney Anita Alvarez, who is actually taking credit for filing those first charges. She was asked
First
the question.
of all, hold on, stop. Anita Alvarez, what the hell is she taking credit for? Because she was the one who didn't do a damn thing when it came to this case, and it wasn't until two journalists force a video to be released to the public where we actually found out what happened. She didn't do a damn thing for 4 years with Jason Van Dyke. That's one of the reasons why she lost to Kim Fox.
And the host pushed back on that and said, well, listen, this case was buried for so long. And following this case, there's going to be an investigation into the whole cover up. I mean, there was the leak of the mayor's office emails talking about the case. There were police reports that were corroborated among officers that said something totally different than what actually happened on camera. And like you said, that shooting happened in 2014. It took for William Calloway to sue and submit a FOIA to get the police dashboard camera video released. Brandon Smith to help with that FOIA to get that released. It took for Jamie Calvin, an independent journalist. All of these people are independent journalists, not even institution or general market journalists, who pushed to get all of this information, such as the autopsy report, released out to the public. So it does seem a bit audacious for Anita Alvarez to be taking a victory lap as well. See, she commended the county prosecutor, the special prosecutor in the case, for mentioning those charges that she filed. And then the question was, wait a minute, you filed the first-degree murder charges, but not the second. Well, she said, well, the judge in the case said that you have to go through the prosecution trying to prove that first-degree murder charge before you can even get to the second-degree murder charge. So she's still taking a victory lap based on that.
I also want to bring in Janae Bonsu, co-director of Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100. Also, attorney Chris Stewart, managing partner for Stewart, Say, and Felton out of Atlanta. First and foremost, Janae, I want to go to you. BYP 100 out of Chicago, y'all have been very aggressive in protesting there in Chicago, bringing light not just to this case, but so many others when it comes to police misconduct of Chicago police. Your initial thoughts on the guilty verdict of Jason Van Dyke?
Yeah, I think largely in Chicago right now it's a time of celebration, but also great ambivalence. You know, I'm less interested in whether the conviction should have been a first-degree murder than I am about changing the conditions that allowed Laquan's murder to happen in the first place. You know, I mean, it's a time of reckoning in Chicago right now. This conviction, comes a month after Rahm Emanuel announced that he's not seeking re-election. You know, as you already mentioned yourself, Roland, that we fired Anita. You know, it was grassroots organizing that helped that to happen, to push her out of office, to hold her accountable, not just for this cover-up, but for her whole history in criminalizing Black communities wholesale. This is after pushing Gary McCarthy out, who was then superintendent at the time. And so is this justice? I don't know. It's better than not guilty, but it's also not going to bring Laquan back. The harm has been done. No conviction will bring Laquan back.
Chris Stewart, I want to go to you. Prosecutors, I'm reading the Chicago Sun-Times story. It says prosecutors would have needed to prove that Van Dyke shot McDonald, quote, without lawful justification in light of Illinois' law on the use of deadly force by police. Now, that's what they would need to do to win a conviction on first-degree murder. Again, this is one of those examples to me where the law gives so much leeway to police officers that it makes it very difficult to rise to that level to convict on first-degree murder.
It is. I mean, the extenuating circumstance that I think that they got to second instead of first is that he had the pocket knife, which we know didn't have anything to do with the shooting. He wasn't a threat to the officers, and that bumped it down to the second. But
in fact, Chris, 1 second. In fact, in reading this Sun-Times story, they say the second-degree murder verdict against Van Dyke means that jurors agreed that Van Dyke was guilty of first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt, but that a mitigating factor caused him to shoot McDonald, which was the knife.
Yes. Yeah. So that's how they ended up getting to the second. But he's going to get hammered because those 16 ag assault convictions don't get combined. My understanding is that he'll get 6 years for each charge potentially. So it's huge. But, this is a great victory today. But what about the cover-up? This situation happens all the time. I'm in Chicago every month fighting the Antoine Galat case where he was shot and they covered it up. Same thing. They lied in their police reports. They lied about what happened. It's an epidemic that has to stop.
And in fact, if folks out there, and Janae, I want to go to you on this very issue, and we've been covering this, the reality is we know of Chicago police officers, including bosses of Jason Van Dyke, who did all they could to protect him. You have the officers who went to the Burger King, who destroyed video evidence. You have the officers who lied in terms of the circumstances of Laquan McDonald charging them. From the moment Laquan McDonald was shot, the blue wall actually was erected around Jason Van Dyke, and they tried everything they could to cover up what took place. This is one of the reasons why people don't trust the Chicago Police Department, because they are willing to lie to protect one of their own.
Yeah, the police department swiftly constructed this narrative that media and, everyday people really even challenged. This constructed narrative of, oh, I feared for my life. It was self-defense, had to do what I had to do. A Black person is dead, and no one thinks twice about it. And so one thing that I hope that is a takeaway from this trial is that we have to take these narratives with a grain of salt. And we have to continue to push forward what grassroots activists have been pushing for a long time: community control over police. The CPAC legislation, Civilian Police Accountability Council, is still just languishing in city council right now. Police still get $4 million a day in Chicago, and the neighborhood that Laquan came from, and all the structural conditions that led him to where he is still underfunded. There's still unemployment in these neighborhoods. All of these structural conditions, and so FLP contract still has loopholes that allow Chicago cops to get away with murder, right? And so there's still a lot more work to do. I don't want to undermine this. Delivery of justice with the system that we currently have now, right? But there's still so much more work to do because Jason Van Dyke is not just a bad apple. He's fruit of a rotten tree, right? And so we still have to reconcile the entire institution of policing, particularly in Chicago, that we still have to deal with.
And Chris, in going to you, again, it was a few weeks ago when Attorney General Jeff Sessions spoke nearby Chicago and pretty much said the stress they're under and how these consent decrees are having an impact because officers are choosing not to police. Well, first of all, you would think the Attorney General of the United States should have said to cops, do your job, even if somebody is accusing you of crimes. But what we have here, we have a culture in this country where individuals want to protect cops at all costs, and they don't care about the citizens, even their constitutional rights.
It's sad. Especially with this administration, they've done more behind the scenes to harm civil rights and repeal a lot of the consent decrees that were in place before that just doesn't get discussed on the news. It's just about Trump and not about what they're doing to civil rights in the Justice Department. But the biggest problem, which is why I handle civil rights and I fight for these cases, that police are supposed to be heroes. They're supposed to be the bravest. They're not supposed to get scared and shoot a kid who has a little pocket knife. They're supposed to de-escalate, like the juror said. But the problem is they're acting more as executioners in some situations instead of a hero. And that has to stop. And it only will stop with verdicts like today.
Janae, no word as to whether or not the Department of Justice will pursue any civil rights violation charges against Jason Van Dyke, even though he has been convicted there in state court. Do you believe that, or will you and others put pressure on DOJ to also seek civil rights charges against Jason Van Dyke?
Well, there hasn't currently been any conversations or, push to ask DOJ or pressure DOJ to bring those charges. Especially as an abolitionist organization, I don't think that we are looking to DOJ for justice in this situation. Jason Van Dyke was convicted. The jury ruled in a way that sees his actions for what they were, which is murder and disregard for Black life. And we're going to continue to work on the ground for the changes, wholesale transformation in the city of Chicago that we've been fighting for.
Last question for you, Chris Stewart. Do you see anything in this case where Jason Van Dyke should be brought up on civil rights violations in the shooting death of Laquan McDonald?
Of course, but with this administration, it'll never happen. You see what happened with my Alton Sterling case. DOJ failed to do their job and get involved and bring charges. We won't get any type of civil rights progression or activity until this presidency is over.
All right. Janae Bonsu, as well as Chris Stewart, we certainly appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, and is Domati Pongo still there? He's still there? Yeah. Domati, I do want to ask you the question. Did anybody bring that up at any of the news conferences about the possibility of pursuing civil rights charges against Jason Van Dyke?
I haven't yet heard that. At the news conferences, I was on the ground at the protests, and that is one of the number one things that they're talking about. They're talking about bringing those civil rights charges, and also talking about reforming the police department from bottom up, as Janae and Chris said. I mean, there needs to be a new standard of what use of force is. When you talk about whether someone was fearing for their life, if they have unconscious bias and they're legitimately scared every time they see an African-American face, then yes, they flee for their life. Now, is that fear justified and does it make sense? That's something that isn't talked about. It needs to be objective. And that's what a lot of activists are talking about and what they have been mobilizing around. And also talking about these, as it relates to the civil rights issue, these stop and frisk policies here in Chicago. 70% of the people stopped and frisked are African Americans. We only make up 30% of the city. And that's something that the ACLU, an independent report, found. And this is what Loretta Lynch talked about when she first investigated the Chicago Police Department. So activists are leveraging that as well as they try to call for civil rights violations.
All right, then. Domati, we certainly appreciate all your reporting on this, and we certainly will watch to see what happens next. But as we speak, to Domati, thanks a lot. As we speak, Jason Van Dyke, he is sitting in jail, and we transferred to a state prison. Let's go to our panel. We have political commentator Dr. Wendy Osefo, of course, Johns Hopkins, Brandon Cooper, chairman of the PG County Republican Party, and also via Skype, Ray Baker, host of the Public Agenda podcast. Wendy, I'll start with you. Do you feel as if justice has been served in the case of Jason Van Dyke?
Today, justice has been served, but tomorrow the fight must continue. We have to, be able to stand and say, the little wins are okay, but this is just a piece of the larger issue, which is the police department, not just the Chicago police, but the police department has a culture of corruption. They have a culture of doing violence against black and brown bodies. They have a culture of protecting each other even when they know something is wrong. That is the issue. That is the issue why Laquan McDonald is not here. And as long as that continues to be alive, we will have many more hashtags, and that is my issue. My issue is, yes, this is something historic. This has not been done in 50 years, over 50 years. But then the question then becomes, what happens tomorrow? What happens when another hashtag is trending? Until we can infiltrate these systems and change these systems, then we will continue to see these same type of things.
Brandon.
No, I don't think 6 years for a cold-blooded murder is justice. So
but here's the deal, before you go there. So according to, again, the story you're reading here, as Chris Stewart said, it's minimum of 6 years of second-degree murder. Mm-hmm. But each one of those charges, each one of those shots also carries 6 years. The defense wants themselves concurrently. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so we'll see what the judge
minimum
decides.
Of 6 years. That's still the baseline. It could be more, up to 20.
Could be more. Could be more.
To me, that's not justice. So to the point of the cover-up and the culture you're talking about, let's not forget that 3 police officers right now in Chicago have been charged for conspiracy and cover-up of this case. You mentioned his superior, his boss, also his partner, Van Dyke's partner.
Right.
There's 3 police officers right now.
Others retired.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. One is, and one's still on the force. So those 3 police officers were indicted. You like to talk about unindicted co-conspirators. Rahm Emanuel, I think, fits that bill perfectly. The fact that he's still in office is a shame of itself. So no, I don't think it's justice per se. I think it's progress and a step forward. But as you mentioned, this is the first time in 50 years, and do we have another 50 years for another officer to be charged?
Ray Baker, again, there are numerous other cases. I mean, I'll bring up Dante Servin, off-duty cop, sees a discussion taking place. He decides to jump in. Argument escalates. He pulls his gun out, shoots Rakia Boyd in the head, kills her. Anita Alvarez charges him, but then when they go to court, the judge says she made the wrong charge and he was released. Didn't serve, first of all, never went to trial, didn't serve 1 day in jail, and he killed Rakia Boyd in cold blood. There are numerous other cases of Chicago police officers who have killed folks, and there has been no justice whatsoever. Your thoughts about justice in this case?
I like what Dr. Wendy Osefo had told us earlier, that this was individualized justice, not institutionalized justice. And the thing that's important to remember there, as some of our panelists have outlined, as your organizer from BYP 100 outlined, that's so important to understand the difference. Because if we have to continue to come back to the criminal justice system time and time again just to plead for individual justice, that means wholesale progress and change has not happened. But if we see law enforcement officers are willing to be honest about their partners when their partners are doing wrong, then we will begin to see institutionalized change that will make this not happen anymore. Let's not forget, this is not exclusive to Chicago. We saw the video of Walter Scott being shot in South Carolina. There was a black officer assisting Michael Slager who helped plant the gun or the taser or whatever that was near Walter Scott's body when they were going to concoct their story about how Mr. Scott was a threat to them. So we have to work for institutionalized justice if we expect to see these minor acts to be important. Now, again, for the family of Laquan McDonald, for those citizens who organized and labored out in Chicago, it is important to get the victories, as small or large as they are, because without them, what do we have to sustain us? But it is also important to recognize the difference between individual justice and institutional justice.
Well, and to Ray's point there, the officer who killed Walter Scott went to prison not on murder charges. It was a hung jury. He went to prison because he cut a deal and pleaded guilty to civil rights violations.
Yeah. And I want to share, I definitely agree that under this DOJ, I'm not a fan of Jeff Sessions, never thought he should have been appointed, and I hope that he gets fired, the next one that Trump's fired. But institutional justice that you're talking about is going to come on the state level. We go back to Trayvon Martin. Obama's DOJ did not bring civil rights charges. It's up to the state level, the state prosecutors we talked about. That's where the front line of this defense is. So I understand the anger at the DOJ and the consent decrees. I'm not saying we don't want to focus on that, but we cannot forget the fight and the battle that's taking place on the local level.
I think it's both.
Yeah.
No, and the reason I'm bringing up the
But
civil rights
it's
violation,
heavier on the local level.
well, no, of course. First of all, that's the first line.
I'm glad
Absolutely.
What happens on the state.
Absolutely.
And so which is what we talked about, which is the reason why Anita Alvarez doesn't have a job.
That's right.
Because she was thrown out.
That's right.
That's what happened there. But the point I'm still making, though, is that historically what we have seen was when justice didn't take place on the state level, you still had DOJ.
Right.
And even in this case, even though he is found not guilty of second-degree murder, DOJ can still pursue
That's right.
civil rights charges.
That's right.
But what we have now, though, is the Department of Justice under President Obama, and I would say it's even worse under Trump, in that the DOJ is so skittish where somehow in their mind, if it is not perfect, they won't even attempt to pursue a case, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, look, try the case, and if you lose, but don't do anything.
Right.
Yeah, the laws
Wendy?
are definitely stacked against justice.
And I think that that's the big argument here is we have to do something. And yes, this is individualized and it's something for us to celebrate, but we have to look at the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture here is coming from someone who lives in Baltimore and was on the ground when everything happened with Freddie Gray. This is something that continues to happen all of the time. And as the mother of two black boys, I'm coming at this from a personal level. Like, yes, I'm sure that the family of Laquan feels a sense of relief today, especially like how the jurors called each count one by one with each bullet. However, we need to make sure that there is not another Laquan McDaniel, because that is when we are going to see big time change, and that's what we're looking for.
Well, again, hopefully Ray Baker will see these changes in the police departments, but here's the thing. As long as you have police unions who are protecting their own, as long as you have fellow officers who will lie, who will put their careers on the line and lie. And I still say this here. This is very simple. If Ray Baker or Brandon or Wendy or myself, if any of us filed a false police report and lied in it, we can be pursued on criminal charges.
Yes.
I fundamentally believe that it should be put in every single one of these contracts. If an officer lies in a police report, automatic firing.
That's right.
Not suspension, not discipline, automatic firing. And what should also happen is that it should be in there. If an officer is convicted, again, lose that pension, lose the money, because as long as the city taxpayers are paying for their defense, Ray, they're going to keep doing whatever. But you hit them in the pocketbook, it's going to change their behavior.
Yeah, I think you hit a really good point there, Roland. And one of the things we're seeing, and this is, I'm coming as a person who has done some work on behalf of and in defense of labor unions time and time again. The unions for police officers largely are not functioning in the way that any self-respecting labor union in the United States has functioned for a number of years. They are functioning ostensibly as gangs. And this is not my idea. Charlene Carruthers, who's out of Chicago, has echoed this initially. They are functioning in gangs in ways that protect people, that create this idea of individualized bad apples, where in almost any other line of work, a bad apple may have an adverse situation with someone they serve. Whereas in law enforcement, when they have a bad apple, it is taking people's lives. And we can't afford to continue to have situations where people's lives are being lost because of these so-called, air quote, bad apples. Maryland, for example, I know Brandon's familiar with Maryland. I learned that Dr. Osefo is from Baltimore as well. And Maryland, for example, has what they call the LEBOR, the Law Enforcement's Bill of Rights, which means should a law enforcement officer have a situation where a citizen dies in their hands, that law enforcement officer has up to a week to organize their thoughts, their plans, and then before they have to go and give a report and accounting for. That's not so for any other profession. That's not so for any other. If you have a car accident with a bus driver, that bus driver has to get out there and give their statement at that moment. I'm sure the folks from the ATU would happily take a week to get their story together, but we have to find a consistency if we want to have accountability. But ultimately, we know we don't have this because police, unfortunately and sadly, have not functioned as what we heard one of your previous guests say, which is simply to be the heroes of our society. They've functioned to protect property and class, and more often than not, that means whiteness.